1917 was a big year for Russia. It would endure hunger, world war, revolutions, and two government takeovers. The result was civil war and eventually communism. Prior to the 1900s, the majority of Russia's population were poor, peasant farmers. Russia was a monarchy ruled by the Tsars, who had absolute power. The monarchy failed to address the persistent poverty and hunger affecting the peasants and the emerging working class. Writings by Karl Marx, supporting a classless society, inspired revolutionary ideas among protesters. One of them was Vladimir Lenin. Russia entered World War I in 1914, which disrupted its fragile economy and strained infrastructure. As the war dragged on, Russia suffered a series of major defeats, weakening its morale on the home front. When February 1917 arrived, the citizens of Russian capital Petrograd, or St. Petersburg, had enough. Protests spread across the city, with government soldiers eventually joining in. On March 2, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II of the Romanov dynasty had no choice but to step down. People celebrate the end of the monarchy by destroying symbols of power. Tsar's statues are toppled, and the Romanov family's double-headed eagles are torn down. A provisional government is formed, made up of several political parties who plan to hold democratic elections. In Petrograd, a workers' council, or Soviet, is formed. The two bodies share power. The Bolshevik Party, consisting of radical socialists, appeals to the working class need for land and food and promises to end the war. Led by the charismatic Vladimir Lenin, as mentioned earlier, the Bolsheviks don't believe the provisional government represents the majority of the people. On April 1917, Lenin returned to Petrograd after years of exile in Switzerland. Chaos builds across Russia, peasants seize land, workers take control of factories, and soldiers desert the war front. Lenin and the Bolsheviks take advantage of the chaos and call for the overthrow of the government. On October 26, the Bolsheviks stormed the government's winter palace in Petrograd and seize power. Lenin and his supporters take control without sharing power across political parties, and the Bolsheviks eventually become the Communist Party. The 1917 revolutions led to the creation of the Soviet Union, the world's first communist state, and it becomes an ideological and political adversary to the United States and the democracies of Western Europe.
By the time when Rasputin was murdered, most of the Russians had lost faith in the leadership of the Tsar. The country was in total chaos. There was a huge population growth at the beginning of the 20th century, causing the working class to become one of the largest social classes. Their living condition was as terrible as you can imagine under the leadership of the Tsar. They had good reasons to rout. Overcrowded housing with often deplorable sanitary conditions, long hours at work, the constant risk of injury and death from poor safety and sanitary conditions, inadequate wages, and so on. The devastation of World War I is another push factor that led to this revolution. High casualties, economic ruin, and widespread hunger made people feel hopeless. This country needed a revolution to get off this situation. This is one of the rally cries from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Around the time of 1915, the working class was the social class that suffered the most from the Tsar. It's a time for them to stand up and protest. What they were asking for was as simple as peace, land, and bread, and they would not grant it. The call, peace, land, and bread, was proposed by the Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin. It quickly gained an incredible amount of support within the working class and won a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. Peasants were also ready to rout, as their lives under the rule of the Tsar were nothing close to satisfying either, and therefore a massive force consisting and mostly the lower class was united, determined to overthrow the corrupted government. On March 8, 1917, demonstrators clamoured for bread took to the streets in the Russian capital of Petrograd, supported by 900 men and women on strike. The protesters clashed with police but refused to leave the streets. On March 10, the strike spread among all of Petrograd's workers, and irate mobs of workers destroyed police stations. Several factories elected deputies to the Petrograd Soviet, or Council of Workers' Committees, following the model devised during the Revolution of 1905. On March 11, the troops of the Petrograd Army garrison were called out to quell the uprising. In some encounters, regiments opened fire, killing demonstrators, but the protesters kept to the streets, and the troops began to waver. On March 12, the revolution triumphed when regiment after regiment of the Petrograd garrison defected to the cause of the demonstrators. The soldiers, some 15,000 men, subsequently formed committees that elected deputies to the Petrograd S.
The October Revolution, also called the Bolshevik Revolution, was a time when the Bolsheviks successfully seized power. This is the second and the last revolution of the Russian Revolution of 1917. On October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks led their forces in the uprising in Petrograd against the provisional government. In the early morning, from its heavily guarded and picketed headquarters in Smolny Palace, the Military Revolutionary Committee designated the last of the locations to be assaulted or seized. The provisional government was virtually helpless to offer significant resistance. Railways and railway stations had been controlled by Soviet workers and soldiers for days, making rail travel to and from Petrograd impossible for provisional government officials.
Vojvolasti, meaning dual power, were two opposite powers, the Soviets and the Russian provisional government of the Social Democrats, coexisted and competed for legitimacy. Lenin believed that this unstable situation provided with the Soviets and the Bolsheviks with a unique opportunity to seize power by smashing the weak provisional government and establishing itself as a basis for a new form of state power. In April 1917, assisted by the Germans, Lenin returned to Russia from Switzerland. At once, he took control and direction over the Bolsheviks. He prepared to seize power using a clear plan. First, the Bolsheviks had to gain control of the Petrograd Soviet. Second, then they would need to take power in the same name of the Soviet. Third, the process would then be repeated in other cities. He managed to convince the Soviets to follow his plan and eventually taking over Russia.
Civil war broke out in Russia in June 1918. The warring factories included the Red and White armies. The Red armies fought for Lenin's Bolshevik government. The White army represented a large group of loosely allied forces, including monarchists, capitalists, and supporters of democratic socialism. In July, the anti-Bolshevik White Russian forces advanced on Yekaterinburg, where Nicholas and his family were located, during a campaign against the Bolsheviks. On July 16, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children and 4 servants were ordered to dress quickly and go down to the cellar of the house in which they were being held. There, the family and servants were arranged in 2 rows for a photograph they were told was being taken to quell rumors that they had escaped. Suddenly, 1,000 armed men burst into the room and gunned down the imperial family in a hail of gunfire. Those who were still breathing when the smoke cleared were stabbed to death. The Russian Civil War ended in 1923 with Lenin's Red Army claiming victory and establishing the Soviet Union.
Welcome to Griffiths Broadcast, the #1 broadcast in Vancouver. Good to have you guys join us today. Sit back, relax, enjoy.
Today's discussion topic is on the Russian Revolution of 1917.
Let's start off with the Civil War. I wonder which one is a good side, the Red Army or the...
I think neither of them is necessarily good or bad. Both of their purposes were reasonable, and even though the Red Army won, It doesn't mean that they're just good in general.
So the Red Army was trying to return their power and the White Army was trying to get the power back.
Yes, though I personally think what the Red Army was proposing was what the country needed. You see, the only reason why they won is it had the support of the people. The Bolsheviks were speaking the mind of people. They were fighting for things that people needed to survive. Well, also communism, but the White Army was only fighting for their ideal political system. And you can't just convince people who are having trouble just surviving to believe in your ideology. That sounds so random.
I guess the White Army's ideology probably makes sense, but the Bolsheviks use the things that the peasants and workers need to most as their propaganda, so people trust them so much. And I have another question there. So we keep talking about Lenin. So what's special about him? I mean, I know he was a leader of the Bolsheviks and the leader of the first communist country, but how influential and important he has.
This guy's ideology was definitely very different from the period when the Tsar was ruling. After the revolution, he initiated many reforms. First, he took land from the Tsar, the church, nobles, and other landlords, and redistributed it among the peasants to reform the agricultural section, and rewarded the peasants for their loyalty. Labor conditions were improved with working hours, limited to a maximum of 8 hours a day and 40 hours a week. The capitalists who had always owned the factories and farms had been profit-driven, neglecting basic human rights of workers.
I hear Marx and Lenin spurs women's rights. Did Lenin do something to establish gender equality?
Well, women were not allowed to occupy senior positions, as these were reserved for men. Women had not been allowed to educate themselves during the rule of Tsar, and Lenin wanted to see this to be changed by having both men and women attending classes together and sharing the same philosophy. Speaking of education, Lenin realized that the people who had helped him overthrow the provisional government were mostly poor and could not afford to pay for their education. So he embarked on providing free education for everyone.
Okay, I suppose he had a good reputation, right?
Not necessarily. His ideology is kind of similar to some sort of religion. Like, I'll be your savior if you put faith in me, my party, and my ideology. But he took a step further. He believed the opposition should be eliminated. That's why the Red Terror happened, and about 100,000 upper-class people, nobles, and people who were against the Communist Party died. I mean, he was still a good leader for those who followed him. I guess it would be hard to retain communism if there was some sort of oppression.
Well, I have to say the way he did it is quite brutal.
Well, if you evaluate the behaviors of historical figures with modern moral standards, 99% of them would just be terrible people. Especially, it was wartime, so it was just natural to see someone die in front of you. And when you see too much of this, you just get apathetic. To people at the time, killing didn't sound as horrible as it sounds like now. It was just the easiest way to get rid of someone. Like, what if Lenin was the leader of Russia today? Would he just kill 100,000 people? I mean, killing 100,000 people is brutal, too, but when you consider the context, we don't know how bad it actually was. A common mindset at the time was, yo, you're in my way and you're making my life harder, guess what? You die. So, but again, common doesn't mean good, though your mindset could be affected by the status quo. Anyways, can you think of more drastic changes that happened right after the revolution?
The most important and obvious one would be the establishment of communism and the Tsarist rule ended. So this means not only the factories, but also the banks were nationalism. Thus, a national council run the country's economy.
What about long-term consequences?
Oh well, the revolution paved the way for the rise of communism and was as an influential political system around the world. And it set the stage for the rise of the Soviet Union as a world power. And then there are also not so good ones like the Civil War, which caused the death of more than 8 million people. Oh, and right terror.
Don't forget about another important short-term consequence. Russia pulled out from World War I not too long after the establishment of the new government.
Yes, Tesla believed that Russia must end its participation in the war so that the nation could focus on building a communist stage.
And there are longer-term consequences, like the rise of Joseph Stalin in the Cold War.
So, did the revolution create the entirely new country? Was there anything that remained the same?
As we said, there are a lot of changes that happened right after the revolution or later on during the development of the country. The social structure was reshaped. No more wealth-based social classes, religions were not encouraged. Everyone had equal access to resources and education. However, there was still something that remained the same, which was the autocracy. Before the revolution, the political system was an absolute monarchy, which is considered a dictatorship. And Lenin was argued to be the world's first totalitarianist, meaning the government exerts total control over the lives and freedoms of citizens.
But that's only an
True, but then we have Joseph Stalin. I think we need some background context here. He was quite close to Lenin when he was young, and Lenin saw him as a tough character and a loyal follower capable of getting things done behind the scenes. He was heavily influenced by Lenin, but he became more of an authoritarian as he got older. Starting from 1922, Lenin had suffered a series of strokes which compromised his ability to speak, let alone govern. His absence paved the way for Stalin to begin consolidating power. Lenin resented Stalin's growing political power and saw his ascendancy as a threat to the USSR. Lenin dictated a number of predictive essays about corruption of power in the Communist Party while he was recovering from his stroke in late 1920 and early 1923. The document, sometimes referred to as Lenin's Testament, proposed changes to the Soviet political system and recommended that Stalin be removed from his position.
Then Lenin died in 1924 and Stalin came to power. And Stalin was the kind of leader who would do anything to return his power. There was a thing called the Great Purge, which is basically Stalin killing his rivals and around 1 million people died too. Also, his plan of focused collectivization of Soviet agriculture, in which the government took control of farms, fake famine and killed millions of people. Millions of farmers refused to cooperate with Stalin's orders and were shot or exiled as punishment. I think this is pretty close to society under the rule of the Tsar. Farming and dictatorship once again become problems. Definitely, the establishment of communism in Russia gave hope to some other countries in similar situations. It inspired other communist movements around the world in regions such as South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. For example, like Cuba also experienced its own communist revolution, the Cuban Revolution, which began in July 1953 and was led by the Revolutionary Federal Control. Similar to the October Revolution, the Cuban Revolution abolished a more traditional hierarchy in order to establish greater or overall equality, especially in the abolition of the former dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. There are many countries that experience similar revolution to establish communism. The Chinese and Vietnamese revolutions are also really interesting ones to look at if you like this topic.
So that's it, folks. Thank you for listening to Griffin's podcast. We discussed the White and Red Army, the long and short-term consequences, Lenin's historical significance, and what influence Russia had on other countries.
Stay tuned for the next episode. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.